On the morning of November 12, 1983, Garson Teague walked into First National Bank of Shelby, Montana, with a title certificate in one hand and $300 cash in the other. He was 62 years old, wearing Carhartt overalls that had been patched twice at the knees and work boots held together with duct tape around the soles. His hands were stained black from motor oil that no amount of lava soap could ever completely remove. The lobby was warm, too warm, the kind of warmth that comes from oil heat you don't have to chop yourself. Garson walked past the velvet ropes to the loan officer's desk, where Brad Kellerman sat reviewing paperwork in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Garson made in a month. Brad looked up. He was 35 years old, MBA from University of Montana, transferred to Shelby 2 years earlier from Missoula. He wore a Rolex his father-in-law had given him and drove a leased Mercedes 300D. He had opinions about people like Garson Teague. "Help you?" Brad, said, not standing up. "Need to talk about a loan." Brad gestured to the chair. Garson sat down slowly. His knees didn't bend the way they used to. "What kind of loan are we looking at, Mr. Teague?" "Garson Teague. I bought a truck. Need to borrow against it for operating capital." Brad pulled out a form. "All right. Year, make, model?" 1948 Ford F5 flatbed." Brad's pen stopped moving. He looked up. "I'm sorry, did you say 1948? "Yes, sir." "Mr. Teague, our lending policy doesn't cover vehicles over 10 years old. We can't establish proper valuation on paid $300 for it." The silence that followed was the kind that happens right before someone starts laughing. Brad didn't disappoint. It started as a chuckle, then it built. His shoulders shook. He put his pen down and leaned back in his chair, and the laugh got louder. A woman at the teller window turned to look. So did the branch manager in his glass office. $300, Brad repeated, wiping his eyes, "for a truck that's, let me do the math here, 35 years old." "Yes, sir." "Where'd you buy this investment estate sale?" "Heard a yard off Highway 2. Been sitting there since '76. Brad was still smiling, but now it had edges. "And what exactly are you planning to do with a truck from the Truman administration?" "Haul firewood. Winter's coming. Figure I can sell cords to folks in town." "Mr. Teague," Brad folded his hands on the desk like a teacher explaining something to a slow child, "I've been in banking for 12 years. Before that, my father was in banking for 30. I've seen a lot of bad business decisions walk through that door, but this might be the worst." Garson didn't say anything. "You want to start a firewood business with a 35-year-old truck that you bought from a junkyard for $300. Do you have any idea what kind of liability you're looking at? What happens when that heap breaks down on someone's property? When the brakes fail? When the steering gives out?" "Truck's solid." "Solid." Brad laughed again. "Mr. Teague, solid trucks don't end up in junkyards. You know what ends up in junkyards? Junk." A few people in the lobby were watching now. Garson felt heat crawling up his neck, but he kept his voice level. "I've been working on trucks since before you were born, son. I know what's solid and what's not." "Is that right?" Brad leaned forward. "Then let me educate you on something. This is 1983. We have technology now. Fuel injection, computerized ignition, safety standards. Nobody hauls commercial loads in a truck that belongs in a museum, and nobody with any business sense expects a bank to finance it. I'm not asking you to finance the truck. I'm asking to borrow against it. Title's clear. The title is worthless. I could use it for scratch paper, and it'd have more value." Brad slid the form back across the desk. "Here's what I'm going to do for you, Mr. Teague, because I'm not completely heartless. We have a special program for qualified borrowers looking to start legitimate businesses. I can get you approved for a loan on a 1983 Ford F250 or Chevy C20, new truck, full warranty, dealer support, $14,000, financed over 7 years at 12.5% interest. You'll have a real truck, something that won't embarrass you or break down every other day." "I don't want debt." Brad blinked. "Excuse me?" "I don't want to owe $14,000. I want to work with what I've got." "What you've got is junk. What I've got is paid for." Brad's smile disappeared. His voice dropped, and when he spoke again, it was cold. "Mr. Teague, let me be very clear with you. You walk out of this bank with that $300 scrap heap, you're going to fail, not might fail, will fail, and when you do, when that truck dies on you in the middle of winter and you're stuck with a load of unsold firewood and no way to deliver it, don't come back here asking for help, because the answer will be no. Garson stood up. His chair scraped against the tile floor. Appreciate your time. One more thing. Brad's voice followed him toward the door. You might want to call Sturdivant Salvage. Tell them you've got another truck for the yard. Save yourself the towing fee. The lobby was quiet. Every eye in the bank watched Garson Teague walk out. Let me tell you about Brad Kellerman, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what happened next. Brad's father owned 3 car dealerships in Missoula. Brad had grown up around money, around new vehicles, around the smell of leather interiors and the gleam of showroom floors. He'd gone to college because his father told him to, studied business because it seemed easy, and taken the banking job in Shelby because his wife wanted to live near her parents. He was good at his job in the way that people are good at things they don't actually care about. He knew the numbers, knew the ratios, knew how to spot a bad risk from across the lobby. And Garson Teague, with his duct-taped boots and his junkyard truck, was exactly the kind of bad risk that Brad had been trained to identify and reject. But there was something else, too. Something Brad wouldn't have admitted even to himself. He didn't just think Garson would fail, he wanted Garson to fail, because men like Garson represented everything Brad had been taught to despise: poverty dressed up as principle, stubbornness mistaken for wisdom, old ways that refused to die even when the world had moved on. 3 days after the bank meeting, Brad was having lunch at the Griddle Cafe when Garson's truck drove past. It was impossible to miss. The 1948 Ford F5 looked like something that had been dug out of the ground and partially reassembled. The cab was primer gray, with rust blooming through like brown flowers. The passenger door was a different color than the driver's door. The flatbed was made of weathered planks, some lighter than others, clearly scavenged from different sources. The front bumper was held on with bolts that didn't match. One headlight was cracked. The exhaust pipe was wired to the frame with coat hangers. Brad watched it rattle down Main Street, spewing blue smoke, the engine making a sound like a cement mixer full of rocks. Jesus Christ, he said to himself. His lunch companion, Dale Morrison, from the feed store, followed his gaze. That Garson's new rig? New is a generous word. Heard he bought it for $300. I heard the same story from him in my office. Brad cut his steak with more force than necessary. Came in asking for a business loan with that thing as collateral. I almost called social services. Dale laughed. What'd you tell him? I told him the truth. That truck's worth more as scrap metal than transportation. Told him to buy something from this decade if he wants to run a business. You think he'll make it? Through winter? Not a chance. Brad leaned back, warming to the subject. Here's what's going to happen. That truck's going to break down, and it will break down, probably multiple times, and Garson's going to spend whatever money he makes on repairs, if he even gets that far. My guess? First cold snap, that motor won't turn over. It'll sit in his driveway until spring, and then he'll sell it back to the junkyard for $50. Maybe. Not maybe. Definitely. Brad pointed his fork toward the window where the truck had disappeared. You can't run a business on sentiment and duct tape. At some point, you need actual equipment, professional equipment. But guys like Garson, they don't get that. They think because something's old, it's got character. It doesn't have character, it's just old. What Brad didn't know, what he couldn't know, sitting there in the warm cafe with his medium-rare steak, was that Garson Teague had spent the last 3 days doing something Brad had never done in his entire life. He'd been learning his equipment from the ground up. Let me tell you about those 3 days. Garson had bought the truck on a Saturday. Sunday morning, he towed it home behind his neighbor's Dodge and pushed it into the lean-to behind his house. Then he'd done what his father had taught him to do with any machine. He'd taken it apart, not all the way, but far enough. He'd pulled the valve covers off the flathead V8 and examined every valve, every spring, every rocker arm. He'd drained the oil and cut open the filter to check for metal shavings. He'd dropped the oil pan and inspected the bearings. He'd pulled each spark plug and looked at the carbon patterns to see which cylinders were running rich and which were running lean. The engine was tired. 60,000 miles, maybe more. The odometer had stopped working sometime during the Eisenhower administration. The valve guides were worn. The rings were allowing some blow-by. The timing chain had slack in it. But the crank journals were smooth. The cylinder walls still had crosshatch. The camshaft lobes showed even wear. It was tired, but it was honest. Garson had rebuilt the carburetor on his kitchen table, replacing the float and the needle valve with parts he'd ordered from a catalog. He'd retimed the ignition. He'd replaced the fuel pump and blown out every line. He'd pulled the generator and rewound the armature by hand, something he'd learned working at the Butte mine during the war. The transmission was even simpler. It was a 4-speed manual with a granny low first gear designed for crawling up mountain grades with heavy loads. Garson had drained the gear oil, which came out black and smelling like burning metal, and refilled it with fresh 90 weight. He'd adjusted the clutch linkage and replaced the throwout bearing. The rear end was a full-floating Dana axle with 5.83 gearing. Low, slow, but unstoppable on hills. Garson had pulled the diff cover, checked the ring and pinion for chips, and replaced the carrier bearings. By Tuesday night, the truck ran, not smoothly. The flathead V8 had a loping idle and a tendency to diesel when you shut it off, but it ran, and more importantly, it pulled. Wednesday, Garson had loaded his chainsaw and his wedges and driven 15 miles up into the Forest Service land in the Little Belt Mountains. He'd cut 2 cords of lodge pole pine, bucked it, split it, and stacked it on the flatbed. Then he'd driven back down. The truck had climbed the switchbacks in second gear, never overheating, never losing power. Coming down, Garson had used the engine for braking, the way the truck was designed to be used, and the manual transmission had held the load without complaint. That was the truck Brad Kellerman had seen driving through town, 2 cords of split firewood, 6,000 pounds, the old Ford carrying it like it was nothing. Now let me tell you about Brad's operation, because the contrast matters. Brad Kellerman didn't just work at the bank, he also ran a side business, something he'd inherited when his wife's father died the previous winter, Kellerman Firewood Supply. The old man had run it as a hobby, cutting a few cords each fall and selling them to friends. But Brad saw potential. He'd invested. First, he bought a 1983 Chevy Silverado, 3,500 dually crew cab long bed, $18,500, financed through his own bank at employee rates. Then he bought a commercial-grade log splitter, a new steel chainsaw, a hydraulic dump insert for the truck bed. Total investment, $24,000. He'd hired 2 young guys from town, Casey and Jeff, both in their early 20s. He paid them $8 an hour to cut and split while he handled sales and delivery. He charged premium prices, $85 a cord, delivered and stacked. It was working. By mid-November, Brad had sold 40 cords and cleared nearly $2,000 in profit. He was the main supplier in Shelby. People trusted the name. They trusted the new truck with the company logo on the door, and then Garson Teague showed up at Martha Henderson's house with a cord of firewood for $60. Brad heard about it that evening. Martha's son worked at the bank, and he mentioned it in passing. "Some old guy with a beat-up truck sold my mom firewood today. $60. She said it was good wood, too. Dry, split nice." Brad felt something tighten in his chest. "Old guy? Garson Teague? Yeah, that's him. You know him?" "I know him." That night, Brad drove past Garson's house. The flatbed was parked in the driveway, empty. Someone had written on the side of the truck in white paint, "Teague Firewood, $60 per cord." Brad sat in his Mercedes, staring at that paint. $60, $25 less than Brad's price, and Garson's overhead was nothing. No loan payments, no employees, just an old man and an older truck. The next morning, Brad lowered his prices to $70 a cord. 2 weeks later, he lowered them again to $65. It didn't matter. Garson was selling wood faster than Brad could match. And the reason was simple. People liked him. They liked the old man who showed up in the ancient truck, who stacked the wood himself, who didn't talk much but worked steady. They liked that he'd lived in Shelby for 40 years, that he'd worked the mines, that he'd raised 3 kids in the house on Oilmont Road after his wife died. They liked that he didn't have a logo or a business card or a sales pitch. They trusted him in a way they'd never trust Brad Kellerman. By the first week of December, Brad had sold 12 cords. Garson had sold 43. Let me tell you about the moment Brad's resentment turned into something uglier. It was December 10th, a Friday evening. Brad was at the Mint Bar having a beer with Dale Morrison when Garson walked in. He was there to pick up a to-go order, standing by the bar in his work coat, not bothering anyone. Brad had been drinking. Not drunk, but enough. He called across the room. "Hey, Garson, how's the museum piece running?" Garson looked over, said nothing. "I'm serious. I'm curious. How many times has that truck broken down on you? 3, 4? None." "None?" Brad laughed. "Come on, that truck's held together with prayers and baling wire. Runs fine, for now." Brad stood up, walked over. He was smiling, but it wasn't friendly. "You know what I think? I think you got lucky. I think that truck's one cold morning away from seizing up, and when it does, you're done. And I want you to know, when that happens, when you come crawling back to the bank asking for a real loan on a real truck, I'm going to remind you of this conversation." Garson looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something Brad never forgot. "You're scared." "What?" "You're scared of a 62-year-old man with a junkyard truck. That's why you're talking like this. That's why you lowered your prices. You're scared I'm showing people they don't need what you're selling." Brad's face went red. "I'm not scared of anything. I'm trying to help you understand reality. Reality is I'm outselling you 3-to-1. Reality is I paid $300 for something you think is worthless, and it's feeding me better than your $20,000 truck is feeding you. You don't know what you're talking about. I know I sleep at night, do you?" Brad didn't answer. Garson picked up his to-go order and walked out. The bar was quiet. Dale Morrison looked at Brad. "Maybe you should let it go." "Let what go?" "This thing with Garson. You're making it personal." "He's making it personal. Undercut my prices, taking my customers." "It's a free market, Brad. It's my market. My wife's father built that business. And Garson's trying to feed himself. There's room for both of you." "No," Brad said quietly. "There's not. Let me tell you about what happened next, because this is where pride turns into prophecy." Brad started telling people about Garson's truck. At the bank, at the cafe, at the Saturday morning coffee group at the Elks Lodge. He told them the Ford was dangerous, that it wasn't properly insured, that the wood Garson sold probably wasn't seasoned right, that anybody buying from Garson was taking a risk. Most people ignored him, but some listened. Brad had credibility. He was the loan officer. He wore the suit. He drove the Mercedes. By mid-December, Garson's sales had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. And then winter came, not the normal Montana winter. The winter of 1983 to 84 was the kind that gets written about in history books. Arctic air poured down from Canada and stayed. By December 20th, Shelby hadn't seen a temperature above 0 in 8 days. By Christmas, it had been below 0 for 2 straight weeks. The cold did things to machines, modern machines. Brad's Silverado started having problems on December 22nd. The fuel system froze. The computer-controlled carburetor wouldn't adjust properly. The truck would start, run for 10 minutes, and die. Brad took it to the dealership in Great Falls. They kept it for 3 days, replaced the fuel filter and some sensor, charged him $400. It worked for 2 days. Then it froze again. Casey and Jeff, Brad's employees, both quit. It was too cold to work outside. They found jobs at the grocery store. Brad was alone. He tried to keep delivering. He'd get the truck started, load the wood himself, drive to a customer's house. Halfway there, the truck would sputter and die. He'd coast to the shoulder, wait 20 minutes, get it started again. By the time he made the delivery, he'd be 2 hours late and frozen half to death. On January 4th, Brad had 6 orders backed up. He couldn't fill any of them. He called the dealership. They told him the cold was affecting the computerized systems, that there wasn't much they could do until the temperature came up. When will that be? Probably February. Brad hung up. Meanwhile, Garson's truck ran every single morning. The Flathead Vi8, with its simple carburetor and mechanical ignition, didn't care about the cold. Garson would go out at 6 a.m., pull the choke, turn the key, and the motor would fire. Every time. It would cough and sputter for 30 seconds, then settle into that familiar loping idle. Garson would let it warm up for 5 minutes, then drive away. No computers to freeze, no sensors to fail, just iron and steel and gasoline and spark. By mid-January, Garson was the only firewood supplier operating in Shelby. People who'd listened to Brad's warnings were now calling Garson, asking if he had wood available. He did. He'd been cutting all through December, stockpiling, and now he had over 60 cords stacked behind his house. He delivered 7 cords on January 15th, 9 cords on January 16th, 12 cords on January 17th. The old Ford didn't miss a day. On January 20th, Brad Kellerman sat in his living room watching Garson's truck drive past his window. For the 3rd time that day, the white paint on the side, Teague firewood, looked like an insult. Brad's Silverado sat in his driveway, dead. The bank was holding $2,000 in unfulfilled firewood orders. His reputation was circling the drain. That evening, Brad did something he'd sworn he'd never do. He drove to Garson's house. Let me tell you about that conversation, because it's the moment everything changed. Garson was in the lean-to, stacking split wood onto the flatbed. The overhead light was a single bulb on an extension cord. His breath came out in clouds. He didn't stop working when Brad pulled up. Brad got out of the Mercedes and walked over. He stood there for a moment, watching Garson work. "You were right," Brad said finally. Garson set down a piece of wood, turned around. "About what?" "I was scared. I am scared." Brad looked at the Ford, then back at Garson. "I've got $24,000 tied up in equipment that doesn't work. You've got $300 in a truck that runs every day, and I can't figure out how that's possible. You want me to explain it?" "I want you to help me." Garson studied him. "Help you how?" "I've got 6 customers who've been waiting 3 weeks for firewood. I can't deliver. My truck won't run. If I don't fill those orders by the end of the month, I'm going to lose those accounts permanently, and I'll deserve to." Brad's voice was tight. "I'm asking if you'll deliver for me. I'll pay you whatever you want." "Why would I do that?" "Because you're not like me." Brad looked at the ground. "Because when I walked into that bar and tried to humiliate you, you didn't fire back. You just told me the truth, and the truth is I need help, and you're the only person who can give it." Garson was quiet for a long time. Then he said, $50 a cord. I deliver, you keep the customer relationship. That's fair. And one more thing." "What?" "You stop telling people my truck is dangerous. You stop telling people I'm a risk. You let my work speak for itself." Brad nodded. "Done." They shook hands. Garson's grip was like iron. For the next 6 weeks, Garson Teague delivered firewood for both businesses, his own customers and Brad's. He worked 7 days a week, sometimes making 4 trips a day. The old Ford ran through January, through February, through the coldest winter Montana had seen in 20 years. Brad's Silverado didn't run consistently until March. By the time spring came, something had changed in Shelby. People knew the story. They knew about the bank meeting, about Brad's warnings, about the bar confrontation, and they knew that when winter showed its teeth, the truck everyone had laughed at was the only one still working. Let me tell you about what happened in April of 1984. Garson was at the feed store buying chainsaw oil when Brad walked in. They hadn't spoken much since the winter ended. Brad had paid Garson for the deliveries, $3,000 total, and had gone quiet. "Garson," Brad said, "you got a minute?" They walked outside. Brad's Silverado was parked on the street, but next to it was something else, a 1949 Ford F4 panel truck, faded green paint, rust on the rockers, but the tires were good, and the glass was intact. "Bought it yesterday," Brad said, "from an estate sale in Dutton. Guy's son didn't want it. I paid $400. Garson looked at the truck, then at Brad. "You gonna fix it up?" "I'm gonna try. I was hoping—" Brad hesitated. I was hoping maybe you could teach me how to work on it, how to keep it running. I don't want to make the same mistakes. Garson walked around the panel truck slowly. He looked at the engine, the frame, the bed. Then he opened the driver's door and sat in the cab. The bench seat was cracked, but solid. The steering wheel was Bakelite, worn smooth by decades of hands. He climbed out. "Flathead V8?" he asked. "Yeah, same as yours." "Transmission?" "Four-speed. The son said his dad used it to deliver bread in the 50s. Garson nodded slowly. "Bring it by Saturday morning. We'll drain the fluids, see what we're working with." Brad's face changed. Relief, gratitude, something else. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. If that engine's seized, you're going to spend 3 months freeing it up. And I'm not doing the work for you. I'm just going to show you how. That's all I'm asking." They worked on that panel truck every Saturday for the next 4 months. Brad learned how to pull a head gasket, how to lap valves, how to set timing with a test light and a wrench. He learned that older engines were simpler but demanded more understanding, that you couldn't just plug in a diagnostic computer and read a code. You had to listen, you had to feel, you had to know the machine. By August, the panel truck was running, not perfectly, but reliably. Brad sold his Silverado that fall, paid off the loan early. He kept the panel truck and started using it for small deliveries. He never made it his primary vehicle. He wasn't Garson, and he knew it, but he kept it, maintained it, and every time someone asked him about it, he told the story. The story of the winter. He learned the difference between price and value. Let me tell you about the last time I saw that 1948 Ford F5. It was 2006. I was passing through Shelby on my way to Glacier, and I stopped at a diner for lunch. There was a truck show in the town park, nothing fancy, just locals showing off their old rigs, and there, parked under a cottonwood tree, was Garson's flatbed. It had been restored, not to showroom condition, but to working condition. The paint was fresh, Ford commercial gray, the original color. The flatbed planks were new Douglas fir. The engine bay was clean. The chrome was polished. The tires were new, but it still had the dent in the passenger door, still had the white paint on the side, teak, firewood. A woman was standing next to it, talking to a couple with a camera. I walked over. "This your truck?" I asked. "My father's," she said. "He passed in 2001. I kept it running." "Garson Teague?" She looked surprised. "You knew him?" "I knew the story." She smiled. "Everybody in Shelby knows the story." "Does it still run?" "Every day. I use it to haul hay for my horses. 46,000 original miles on the odometer, still on the original block." I looked at the engine. The Flathead V8 sat there like a piece of sculpture, simple and honest. No wires snaking everywhere, no plastic covers, no computers, just metal doing what metal was designed to do. "The banker," I said, "Brad Kellerman. What happened to him?" "Oh, Brad's still around. He's retired now. Sold the bank job 10 years ago. He and Dad stayed friends, if you can believe it. Brad still has that old panel truck, drives it to church on Sundays." She paused, looking at the Ford. "You know what Dad used to say? He said the truck didn't prove anything. The truck was just a truck. What it proved was that people confuse cost with worth. They think expensive means better, new means reliable, debt means success, and sometimes that's true. But sometimes the thing everyone laughs at is the thing that saves you when nothing else will." I asked her one more question before I left. "What did your dad do with the money from that winter when he was the only one delivering?" She smiled. "He bought 40 acres up near the Forest Service land, paid cash, built a small cabin on it. That's where he spent his last years. No mortgage, no debt, just him and the land and that truck. Sounds like he got exactly what he wanted." "He got more than that," she said. "He got to prove that he was right. And for a man like my father, that mattered more than money ever could." I walked back to my car thinking about Garson Teague and his $300 flatbed, thinking about Brad Kellerman learning to rebuild an engine on his kitchen table, thinking about a Montana winter cold enough to freeze modern trucks but not old enough to stop a Flathead V8, and I thought about what happens when someone laughs at the wrong thing. They don't just miss the truth, they make an enemy of it. And when winter comes, and winter always comes, the truth doesn't care how much you paid or what you drive or how good you look in a suit. The truth just keeps running every morning, no matter how cold it gets. That's the difference between a machine and a lesson. The machine eventually wears out. The lesson never does.